You got some. I say it's alright, I said you got some.
Hello, everybody, and welcome. This is the third part in the Our Stories webinar series, and we would like to begin our webinar today on Dismantling White Fragility, a conversation around transformative justice, by opening a healing space tonight. We begin together by first acknowledging and honoring the Indigenous peoples who are the rightful owners of these lands we currently occupy, and acknowledging the suffering and forced unpaid labor of enslaved Africans and African Americans, which enabled the start of this country. Please feel free to comment and acknowledge the Indigenous or ancestral individuals or communities that you would like to honor today. Before we get started, I would like to take a moment and create a space for gratitude for our panelists and for our resilience to the practice of chalice lighting. So I'm going to do that now. We light this chalice in memory of the courage of those who have struggled for freedom, the persistence of those who have struggled for justice, and the love of those who built beloved communities to carry on the light of hope. In the words of James Baldwin, in this passage he wrote, "White Americans, any real change implies the breakup of the world as one has always known it, the loss of all that gave one an identity, the end of safety. And at such a moment, unable to see and not daring to imagine what the future will now bring forth, one clings to what one knew, of dreams that one possessed. Yet it is only when a person is able, without bitterness or self-pity, to surrender a dream they have long cherished or a privilege they have long possessed, that they are set free. They have set themselves free for higher dreams, for greater privileges." Thank you for sharing in this practice of gratitude with us. And I will turn it over to Susie Hess, who will introduce Trauma Informed LA.
Hello, everyone. My name is Susie Hess. I'm a steering committee member and co-founder of Trauma Informed LA. Trauma Informed LA is an all-volunteer grassroots organization founded in 2014. TILA's mission is to foster resilient communities that promote healing and well-being through collaboration, education, and community engagement. We actually started off as 10 social justice activists on a rainy day in LA trying to figure out what we wanted to do together. It was in November 2014, and now we've had over 3,000 folks who have participated. So it's been an amazing journey. Please follow our new podcast, Our Stories Matter, where Yehuda Price and I talk with activists and healers on their healing journeys through activism, film, art, music, breath, and dance. Each storyteller has a unique story, but one with the global theme of community healing and liberation through storytelling. One of my favorite quotes is by journalist Lauren Gilger: "The power of story will save us all." And please know tonight we will provide support to anyone who may feel activated or uncomfortable during this panel. If at any moment you would like to speak to a safe person, just type in the chat box at Trauma Informed LA. I would like to speak to a safe person, and we'll guide you to a breakout room to meet with a safe person for as long as you need. Thank you, everyone.
Okay, hi everyone. My name is Jessica Borja, and I am a steering committee member at Trauma Informed LA. So first, I just want to take a moment to thank all of you for joining us via live stream and YouTube Live from around the world. So before we start our program, we want to share a few housekeeping items with you. So since we are live streaming, it also means that we will be recording tonight's presentation. Please feel free to use a chat room to express acknowledgement of anything that is being said tonight. You can include happy faces, thumbs up, snaps, whatever you'd like. Please do keep the chat non-violent. We will be using the chat room for our Q&A session, and some of our team members We'll be monitoring it to make sure that your questions are seen and addressed. So now it is my absolute pleasure to present the moderator for tonight, Ramona Marchand. So Ramona is a compassionate leader with over 20 years of experience in the public sector as a trainer, coach, advocate, and leader. As a doctoral candidate at USC, she channels her passion to develop innovative ways of supporting vulnerable and marginalized communities. Her current role is in helping to create community and cross-sector partnerships that raise awareness of equity, disproportionality, and disparity for children of color in child welfare. Ramona is a licensed clinical social worker and continues to use her skills to assist in achieving authentic community care opportunities. Ramona also uses her education and experience to promote equity in the Black community. Ramona has lectured and trained on various topics in the areas of child welfare, racial equity, leadership, and trauma. So please help me welcome Ramona Marchand.
Thank you, Jessica. That was wonderful. Thank you so much. So tonight, we're going to embark on a courageous conversation. In the words of Martin Luther King, he said, "The ultimate measure of a person is not where one stands in moments of comfort and convenience, but where one stands in times of challenge and controversy." So I know there's a lot of challenge and controversy around the subject of white fragility, but we're going to welcome this conversation with curiosity and compassion and unity. So I'm really excited to introduce our panel tonight. So first, we have Rebecca Weicker. Rebecca currently is the program manager of Restore Justice, where she leads transformative justice and healing work with victims of incarcerated individuals, both inside prisons and within the community. She creates opportunities for transformation and healing for individuals, families, and communities impacted by violence and harm. Welcome, Rebecca. Dr. Tiffany Dukes, Dr. Tiffany Dukes, thank you so much, is a double Trojan, also like me. She was an athlete at USC and earned her doctorate from the Suzanne DeWerck Peck School of Social Work. Her research was centered around implicit bias within the child welfare system, and she currently is focused on racial disproportionality and disparity of African-American children within systems and implementing programs to combat disparities for all youth within the system. Ms. Bianca Aaron, welcome Bianca. She's an LMFT and she's passionate about making room for the voices the world tends to mute. It's her mission to empower such voices as she's engaged in work and study and volunteer programs in Argentina, South Korea, the Philippines, and Guatemala, and is currently a therapist in South Los Angeles serving the Black community. Ms. Brita Loeb, last but not least, is a social worker and designer who creates trauma-informed, healing-centered, and equitable design processes and spaces. She founded Designing Healing, which serves nonprofits, corporations, schools, healthcare providers, and individuals in reimagining spaces of healing. So welcome, Brita. Thank you so much for all of you all to join us tonight for this courageous conversation. So I'm going to kick it off with asking a question. We know that it's very uncomfortable to have these conversations. However, how do we get comfortable with the uncomfortable? And how do we address the discomfort of these conversations? Brita, would you like to start?
I would. You could see how comfortable I am with these conversations. No, I think that moment of silence is really, indicative of what these conversations carry. And it's really important to pause in that silence and recognize that for a lot of us, these conversations aren't natural. And for someone like myself who's white, we've benefited from not having these conversations. In order to get comfortable with these uncomfortable conversations, I think it's really important to embrace the idea of feeling more than feeling less. And that means leaning into the discomfort and leading into the feelings of shame and guilt and fragility, because ultimately, if we are not embracing those feelings, most likely we're upholding, tenets of white supremacy, like being perfect and being good and thinking that there's one right way to do something. So I think the best way to get uncomfortable in these conversations is to lean into that discomfort.
Thank you. Dr. Dukes.
I think I would like to add the fact that whether or not we acknowledge it, we engage in difficult conversations in our day-to-day lives, whether it's a single father who has to talk to his daughter about her cycle for the first time, whether it's anybody who's in a partnership or relationship. Sometimes hearing your partner's feedback isn't the greatest thing to hear, but nonetheless, we navigate those conversations. We have those conversations, and when we're being real and allow ourselves to be vulnerable, we take in that information and we see that, we could be a better version of ourselves. Having to talk to, your coworker who, you might have a different working style with. So I think it's important for people to really understand that we navigate difficult conversations on a daily basis. So it's not necessarily something new. But I will point out that sometimes it's easier to navigate a difficult conversation because you're invested and you have a relationship with this person or you care about this person. So for me, that level of fragility or not willing to engage in those difficult conversations, to me, shows a lack of interest and desire to have relationship or meaningful relationship, or even if you don't have a relationship, to have understanding, because we do navigate difficult conversations on a regular basis.
Absolutely. Bianca or Rebecca, do you want to comment on this?
Yeah. Oh, Rebecca,
Go-
did you want?
Go ahead, Bianca. Go ahead.
I want to echo what's been said, Dr. Dukes and Rita, in terms of leaning into that and acknowledging that's something that we experience on a regular basis. For me, I'm not sure that I would say necessarily get comfortable with the discomfort or being uncomfortable in these conversations, but managing that discomfort. It's something that BIPOC folks have been doing, Black, Indigenous, people of color, on a regular basis. If you are in spaces that do not reflect your background, it is a habit to learn how to manage discomfort for the sake of professional and social survival. And so it's something that you're able to do, that people are able to do. It's just a matter of acknowledging that that is a practice that needs to be put into place. And it also implies, or it also requires a level of humility to assess yourself and say, okay, I'm uncomfortable for a reason. Why is that? And so really it's a matter of building a practice of managing that discomfort.
Rebecca.
Yeah, I think that it's one aspect of white privilege about whether or not we have to confront this, and whether it's a daily occurrence, is what I just heard. And for me, it's building up that my skill at managing the difficult feelings and how to respond rather than react, and how to take care of if I have shame or discomfort or embarrassment. That those are my feelings and my responsibility to manage, and not to put that onto other people to take care of my feelings. And so to me, that's two things: to put myself into that situation because it's my responsibility, and that it's also my responsibility to manage whatever discomfort I have and take responsibility for that, and learn to tolerate whatever discomfort I have so that I can be present.
It's kind of like a way of being accountable in a way, right? So it kind of leads me to my next question is, like, what does white fragility mean to you, and how does it show up? How does it show up for people who are non-BIPOC, and how does it show up for people who are BIPOC? Bianca, you want to start with this one?
I would describe white fragility as the emerging of that discomfort and tension that arises when someone acknowledges and realizes the terror that is white supremacy and their own contribution to that, and also the contribution to that of people that they care about. It's the tension that comes with the cognitive dissonance of that realization. I would liken it to how people respond to going from maybe like a room where it's dark and then entering into a place that has a lot of light. For the most part, that hurts the eyes. And how people respond to that is they may retreat back into the dark room where it's comfortable. And some people may stay in the light room and allow their eyes to adjust. I think white fragility is the space between, and that space in making that decision about how you're going to respond to now realizing something that you had not acknowledged before.
Right, absolutely. Brita, what do you think about this?
Yeah, I love what Bianca said about the visual of the space. And I think non-BIPOC people a lot of times do have that choice, and they do have the luxury of choosing how they want to show up and how they want to be seen. I think for a lot of white people, white fragility is something that's sort of almost become an innate or natural response because it's so embodied in like a fight, flight, freeze reaction to feeling uncomfortable. So I think for a lot of people, it shows up reactionarily, and it has become something to be like a concept. But I think in reality, people that are white can make a difference and can change whether or not they're going to engage in that reactivity.
So it's interesting. I love also the analogy of the light. I mean, I think that is spot on, Bianca. But what you said about, it's innate about being uncomfortable, and people who are BIPOC have to take the responsibility of holding that level of being uncomfortable. And I see Dr. Duke shaking her head. So can you speak a little bit about what does that look like? How does that show up? And what does that feel like, for us?
And, of course, I don't speak for everybody, and the Black experience, of course, is not monolithic, but when I hear white fragility, to me, it is kind of like a safety retreat, like I don't have to deal with this. I can run behind and say that I'm feeling fragile in this moment. But I know the second part of your question is how does that show up for people of color, BIPOC, Black, Indigenous people of color. It's a very heavy weight because never do we get to show up and be able to retreat. You have that whole stereotype of the strong Black woman. At what point in time do we ever get to be the fragile Black woman? So it is a weight. And even in allyship, even in consideration, when people give space or create space, it is still also a weight to feel like, okay, now that I have this space, I have to manage this space. I have to participate in this space, rather than being just invited into the space and then not having to feel the weight of feeling the space or carrying the space, so it's just always interesting to hear from me as somebody who doesn't get the choice to stand up and be fragile, or even when I want to be vulnerable, I still have to consider it. And, at what point in time is it that we don't retreat back to what's normal or what's comfortable? Because at this point in time, we're adults, and we see what's happening in the world around us. So our inactivity is still very much being active in maintaining whatever systems are oppressive and actions that are oppressive to all people. We're also seeing an increase against, older Asian Americans in our country. I, as a person of color, I can't be satisfied with the fact that that's happening to another minority group, so my inactivity, even as a person of color, is still very much felt across all people of color. So I just really I'm still really mulling on Black fragility as a concept, as an escape, as a retreat. When at the end of the day, we're all adults. And like I said, I really feel that we flex our difficult conversation muscles more than we give ourselves credit for. And just the weight that it continues to put on the shoulders of people of color.
So it's interesting that you should say that. Susie shared a book or a excerpt of a book earlier with me today. It's by Heather McGee, and it's called The Sum of Us and the true cost of racism. And she speaks about how racism hurts non-BIPOC people who perpetuate it, because at the same time, they're the ones that are being hurt as well. And if you think about that in the context of white fragility, you have to understand that if you're not willing, to engage in conversations. And again, not anyone on this particular panel, but if you're like being fragile and saying, well, I don't know what to say, because, then who's that hurting? Because you are oppressing progress and having a conversation and kind of hiding behind it as an excuse, right? So I'm just curious in regards to, they say that there's not anything in society in regards to reverse racism, but how do you view that in the context of this? Bianca.
I was going to say real quick to your point about people being concerned about, or white people or white presenting people being concerned about what do I say in a conversation like this? I mean, there's not necessarily, you don't necessarily have to say anything. Sometimes it's a matter of listening and paying attention and being observant. And really the person you need to address is yourself, maybe in your private time. There's a time and a place. I think that is a showcase of white privilege as well, to think that you have to actually have a voice every single time and take up space every single time in those conversations. Sometimes it's just a matter of listening and practicing that. But I wanted to address that first. But in terms of reverse racism, I would say, I don't know who brought that about. I would like to understand what they think racism means, what that definition is, but understanding it for what it is as a system that has been embedded for centuries into society. To say that there's reverse racism seems to imply that there would be an isolated incident that would showcase that, when in fact, racism is not an isolated incident. It is a perpetual presence of systemic, and not just systemic injustice, but traumatic experiences. Typically, I would say in the context of the United States, for people of color. In other countries, it looks differently because their history is different. But on that concept, you would have to either go back in time and change who the colonizers are if you wanted to reverse racism, or by some chance, people who are now at the, who don't benefit from the system of racism would somehow have to elevate to a position of authority and power and then take over for people who were formerly in those positions. So those don't seem to be two very likely things that would happen. So as far as where we are right now in our space and time, I would say that's not something that I would endorse as a reality.
I would tend to agree with you, Bianca. Rebecca, do you have a comment on that?
Oh, I don't, that concept isn't, I don't know that I have much to add, just that I don't think the concept makes sense historically or presently, because it's a systemic issue. It's not an individual issue. So it doesn't, I don't even know how to talk about what that reverse racism means, because it's not historically based. It's not accurate. I don't know that I have anything else to say about that.
All right.
But like, even to play devil's advocate though, do you think that is the part of the fear? For me, racism is rooted in power and control. And if you have more people of color in power and of control, then there could be opportunities where those powers are abused. Or, I've heard somebody say they should be happy that we're not asking for, we're not seeking revenge, we're just asking for equity. That also makes me think of, that's a part of the fear. If I share power and power is truly shared, then there's opportunity where the oppressed can now become the oppressors.
You're absolutely right. And I think even with Miss McGee talks about in her book that there was a situation in Montgomery, Alabama in the 60s during the civil rights movement where they had to share space for the pool. So instead of be willing to share the space, they filled in the pool and closed the parks and recreation department for over 10 years, just because they didn't want to share that power and share that space to desegregate. I mean, even though I had heard it before, you know, when you hear these things again, you're just boggled by the, like, what are you so afraid of to engage in space and to share space with something? And it's more like, I'm afraid of giving up my power. That's really what it's about, right? Because we've been placed for over 400 years in a position of not having power. And every time we try to move one step forward, we get pushed 10 steps back, right? So now Congress is talking about reparations again, but is that really going to go anywhere in this current climate in our society, right? So we talk about race as a social construct. So how can we change how BIPOC individuals are experienced in society when we talk about this pervasive racism, this illness that really, you know, is just invasive in our society? Brita, you've been quiet for a minute.
I was just making sure I articulated the question correctly. So what do we do about sort of the pervasive and nefarious racism that persists in our society? Was that it, Ramona?
If you think about it, if you think about racism or race as a social construct, like we've been taught, you know, as Americans, as really worldwide, what race looks like. It's a concept, right? Because we know with our DNA, we're 99% the same, right? We send our stuff to, you know, whether it's Ancestry, 23andMe, or if you just, you know, take my blood and your blood, we're going to be very much alike, right? But this concept of race was created. So how can we change how BIPOC people are experienced in society and shift the narrative in regards to race as a social construct?
Yeah, I think I can start this conversation off by speaking from a place of someone who's non-BIPOC and the work that needs to be done internally within the non-BIPOC community.
Rita, you're moving in and out of your mic, so maybe
I apologize. How about now?
Yes.
I was going to say that I can speak to this or start the conversation in the lens of the non-BIPOC community and the work that I think needs to be done, not first there, but in collaboration there with the BIPOC community, because I think there's a lot of trauma, a lot of feelings, a lot of discomfort within the non-BIPOC community that shouldn't be displaced onto the BIPOC community. And I think a lot of the work around deconstructing what it means to be non-BIPOC in the US or in the world is a good start for non-BIPOC people to engage with one another. I just want to offer that to start.
Okay. Dr. Dukes.
Well, you know, I love data. So first of all I don't know, well, I'll take it back. Media portrayal of people of color is very problematic for me. And it a lot of times goes against data, like research shows, you know, like the whole narrative that Black fathers are absent. You know, are Black men and women marrying at the same rate of other ethnicities? That's to be studied. But are Black fathers more likely than any other ethnicity to bathe their children, diaper their children, put their children to bed? Yes, that is what the data shows. That is what the numbers shows. But that is not what is represented in TV, in movies, even movies that are directed by people of color and directed, you know, by people of color. You still see that the story was created by white, you know, presenting individuals. So we still don't have control over our narrative. Yes, we're getting more representation, but the representation is still that of athletes, still that of rappers, still that of, you know, welfare recipients, very completely different from Black women are more likely to complete a 4-year degree than any other ethnicity. Just completely different than, you know, the data and the realities of. So I would love to see the narrative switched, especially within media, especially in news, portrayals of people of color. And then also our curriculums as well in you know, academics. You know, I was seeing another state, I don't know if it's Ohio or Utah, I can't think of the state right now, but they're allowing their students to opt out of Black History Month curriculum. Wow. And that's crazy. Unfortunately, even myself, a lot of my Black history I did not learn until I got to college. well, who I believe myself to be in America is greatly already formed by the time I get to college, so that's way too late. And even those things, I see that there's a review across the academia of reviewing the Black history and history of people of color that is presented in school curriculum is being assessed for, whether or not it's valid or true. So there's a lot of ways for me, in ways that Black people can change, or people of color can be experienced within our society.
Bianca.
Yeah, I agree with everything that's been said. And Dr. Dukes, I appreciate how you broke that down. I would say also with that, in alignment with the curriculum, but also with media and how people of color are received in society in general, there needs to be a mindset change about who we are. I think a lot of times, not a lot of times, it has been created that whiteness is the standard or is the baseline, and anything that is not white is a deviation from that. And so we have special classes or electives, or we have special, whatever, it's a sidebar to say, if you're interested in this person of this community of color, if you're interested in this marginalized community, then you can go over here. But as far as everything else, this is the mainstream and the standard. And so it's kind of this presentation of whiteness as normal. And we see that, even as a therapist, we see that in the history of psychology as whiteness being traditionally seen as what is normal. And the DSM, or the diagnosis framework, has been reformed in a lot of ways over time. But initially it was, if you're not white male Protestant, anything that deviates from that is a diagnosis or is pathologized. And I think in a lot of ways we still do that, even if you're not in the psychology world. There's a tendency to either demonize, pathologize, or whatever, to make someone who is not in alignment with the traditional white American way of thinking or living. And so it's important to first acknowledge that, and then also come into a frame of mind to start embracing, instead of othering, embracing the diversity of cultures and experiences, and allowing space for, even within those communities, for there to be a variety of experiences, and celebrating those as well.
Absolutely. So Frederick Douglass says, if there's no struggle, there is no progress. So Rebecca, how do we start to make progress in this area?
I think that it brings me back to thinking about like the definition of white fragility, which is, I think, wanting to, like for me as a white person, that struggle to acknowledge that the difference between intent and impact, and that no matter, I think as a white liberal person, like I don't want to be part of a club that doesn't that doesn't seem like a great club, that causes oppression, that means that I get things that I shouldn't have, right? And that I am part of that history. And yet I have to acknowledge that whether I want to accept it or not, or whether I want to identify or not, that is the truth. And so I think the progress comes with separating that intention from impact, and acknowledging that it's not about what who I am or what I believe, but it's about, this is a system that I'm part of, and this is what it does. And as soon as I do that, and I'm not caught up in my own shame or self-blame, then I have the space to be able to participate in a way that's productive and see the experience of other people who I'm living with, who I'm part of a community with, who are having an experience that is different than mine because of how this whole system is set up. And so I don't personalize it, but it is personal. I have to take personal responsibility.
Absolutely. And I think I love the concept of intent versus impact. We talk a lot about it, with where I work. And it's what's interesting to me about intent is, are you being honest with yourself? Brene Brown talks about what story are you telling yourself? So what story do you feel non-BIPOC people are telling themselves when it comes to intent versus impact? So just to kind of piggyback on your comment and how do we make progress, Brita, what do you think about that concept in regards to moving progress forward?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of subtleties to white fragility that may not seem as bad in someone's mind, but are equally as disruptive. I was thinking, Rebecca, when you were talking about like intent and impact, and thinking about how sometimes a white person will use something like make a false comparison, be like, you know what, but like I'm Jewish, so you know I kind of also face oppression, or you know I'm a woman and my workplace is male dominated, so I face oppression. So I was thinking about that when you said that, Rebecca, about intent and impact, because I think in that situation it's really clear that you're not really clear, but your intent is that you're trying to relate and be part of a struggle that's not yours, and the impact is that you're really falling short and really disservicing and, you know, potentially re-traumatizing the BIPOC community. So that's my first sort of resonance to your question, Ramona.
Thank you. Dr. Dukes or Bianca, would you like to reply to how do we start to make progress? How do we work together?
I just wanted to kind of respond to Brita's comment. I really appreciate you bringing that up. I think a lot of times, I mean, I'm not white, so I can't say that that's my experience, but this is an observation that I've had, is that, or a conceptualization that I come to, is that we live in a society that caters to white stories and white narratives. And I think a lot of times when people don't feel like their voice is in that space, that's when fragility comes in, and there is a tendency to want to be a part of that conversation as the oppressed, or in alliance with that. That me too, I have that too. And though there are certain experiences that are real, there's a tendency to have a way of dismissing the reality of people who have been under the thumb of a severe form of oppression for years. So I just wanted to respond to Brita and that. So I just appreciate you bringing that up.
Thank you. Dr. Dukes, any comments on this?
I kind of echo the same sentiments that have already been shared, but I do know in order for us to move forward, we have to move forward together. And in order for us to move forward together, at some point in time, there has to be, you know, it's been mentioned before, there has to be some type of humility and mindfulness and intention around moving forward and having these conversations. You know, one of the meeting agreements that is often in, you know, healing spaces is, you know, listening with your heart, like not to compare yourself to me and not to try to find, you know, common ground other than, you know, 99.9% of our DNA is the same. That right there is enough relationship for me, you know. But you know, having these conversations and realizing, you know, it's not about you or I, it's about the collective, and being able to operate and make, you know, decisions that, you know, impact the collective rather one than the other.
So I think the concept of race and the racial climate has challenged all of us. How has it challenged you? And what is one thing you can do moving forward to act with intention to address white fragility?
I'll start with that because I know and there's moments where I'm like, it's not my responsibility to teach. It's really not. Some days I'm like, it's too much, I'm not teaching. But then at the same time, if I'm in a space and somebody is open to learning, yes, it is my responsibility to teach. I'm present, I'm articulate. I feel like, you know, I could really care less the way the conversation goes or if somebody gets riled up, if it's for, you know, the goodness of the collective. So sometimes it is not a responsibility. I will change that word. It is not a responsibility, but sometimes I do love to take the opportunity to teach.
Rebecca, you're shaking your head. What do you think?
Well, I appreciate what Dr. Dukes just said, and so I think that there are constant opportunities. I mean, I know that the idea of humility. I know I make mistakes all the time, and that I am always in a position where I can learn and observe and do better. And so, if I think to slow down, to be aware of how, just what we're saying, how I'm interacting, and then when I do cause harm, to slow down and think about, how I can repair, how I can understand better, and take those opportunities where I am having those interactions and listen and learn from people if they're in a place that they are providing that, and if not, then to do my own work too, and to not depend on the generosity of others to keep work moving forward, but to, again, take responsibility myself. I think that's, for me, the way that I can do it.
Bianca?
Yeah, I wanted to, I guess, processing what my response has been, particularly with the greater awakening, I think, for a lot of people over the past year, has been an affirmation of what, a lot of us have already known and experienced. I think that it is great and it's a blessing that there are people like Dr. Dukes who is willing to take those opportunities. For me, that is something that I've done frequently in the past, not always by choice. And I think that's something people need to be careful about. It's not making the assumption that just because someone is a person of color that they are willing to do that, or that they are charged to do that for the greater good. I think one thing that I learned, one of the things I learned last year is that I'm very tired and there is a need for respite. And I can speak for myself in this particular season of life. I am focused on healing for myself and unpacking for myself a lot of personal trainings and social conditionings that I have to work through with my identity as someone who has moved in non-Black spaces for the bulk of my life. And so it is very difficult for me to try to do that and carry the charge to support other people in coming to an acknowledgement of something we've been yelling and saying for years. And that's not me speaking from a place of a lack of grace. That's me speaking from a place of understanding that this is where I am in this season. And right. I think that is the case for a lot of people of color. So just to be careful and mindful that just because someone is knowledgeable about certain things and is aware of certain things, they may not be in a position to divulge that information and try to help lead and guide you through that at that particular time, or if that's their choice ever. So there are plenty of resources though for people to be able to do that. And there's plenty of people who are open to providing that space. So that's kind of where I think that's kind of where I am coming out of that place of where we are right now, socially, racially, in our society.
So Rita, I know that we talk a lot about the balance of carrying the weight of white fragility, and a lot of people feel that, I will say I can't speak personally, clearly, because I am not white either, but a lot of people talk about the weight, which is part of the fragility. Like, why do I have to, walk on eggshells around, these conversations, and are always apologizing for, like, I don't know what to say, and, the space that I'm taking up. And so what are your comments around that, and how has the concept challenged you?
Yeah, I'm smiling because that resonates with me a lot, and I know you know it resonates with me because one of my, I find sometimes go-to responses is to, oh no, you can have the space, like please have the space, which Dr. Dukes so beautifully said before, you know what, sometimes I just want to be here, I don't want the space. So as a white person, you're like, oh, I'm being so great. I'm giving up space. Like, look at me. But it's really done in a way of just like self-congratulation. And it's really hurting both people involved. Sorry, Ramona, what was the first part of that question? The second part, I mean.
Oh, just the part about how has it challenged you? How has it challenged you, the concept of white fragility? I know that, again, that we talk about balancing it and knowing how to not take up the space, but then also not use it as a crutch to say, oh, but I'm taking up space, because that also can create oppression or feel bad for me because I'm taking up space. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and I think, at least in my own personal journey, whatever that is just even realizing that there's no like mathematical equation of how much space you should or shouldn't take up, and just recognizing that thinking of that it's so linear and that there is a method and there is a way is a characteristic of white supremacy. I really love the article written by Tema Okun and Kenneth Jones about characteristics of white supremacy culture, some of them being perfectionism, either or thinking, have fearing open conflict. So I think in just changing a perspective that a lot of those, delineations of what is good or bad or how much space you should or shouldn't have is really characteristic of white supremacy culture, is freeing, and that you don't have to be so perfect. And that's not to say not to be mindful, not to be humble, but the fact that there is no perfect and you're going to make mistakes, and that might require addressing some of your fragility.
Absolutely. Thank you. Thank you for being so vulnerable to answer that question. So Rebecca, I'm going to start the next question with you because I feel that you have a lot of insight into this, but we know that white fragility and white supremacy, is pervasive within systems. How do we address white fragility in systems, particularly when you're trying to manage up or to try to create change in a system?
Let me think about that for a second. I mean, I think with systems, we have to demand accountability on a systemic level. We have to think about, we have to look at the way that privilege and that disparate impact is happening. And so I think on a systemic level, we have to look at how what people are gaining and what people I'm trying, it's a complicated thing because I think on the individual level, I think sometimes that's easier to see that what I'm talking about. And on the systemic level, white fragility, it's so pervasive that we have to look at who is losing and who is winning, and take responsibility for, as I think Dr. Dukes was talking about really looking at the data and not looking at what we think is happening, but look at really what it looks like on a systemic level, who in our society is benefiting, and look at what the truth is about who really who the winners and who the losers are, and take responsibility with how we vote, with our educational system, and look at those systems in that way. I hope that answered in a way. I feel like it's such a big question.
Yeah,
I'm going to be like, oh my gosh, I don't want to say it's not that I want to say the wrong thing. It's that it's a really it's a question of really how our whole society is organized, right? And so it's really at the very biggest level, how not just how individual people are treated, but how our whole society is set up, and addressing those things. So it's so big that I'm not even sure in a way like how to start, but I guess that's what I'll say for my beginning of my answer, with humility.
Got it. Got it. No, I don't really think that there is one answer to address that particular question. And I know, Brita, you create designing spaces or of healing, to kind of address white supremacy, and maybe perhaps some white fragility in the work that you do. What do you think are some thoughts around systems change when it comes to these concepts?
Well, in you bringing up my work, I'm thinking of systems in more of a visual sense, in a system of a room or a space. So part of my work is using liberatory design and healing center design to make spaces more anti-racist and equitable and healing. So I'm thinking about the ways that you can make a space, like let's just say a conference room when we're in person, more equitable. So what can you do? You can add more soothing colors to the walls. You can add artwork from a local community. You can make sure that you're using on-screen translation. You can add different adjustable arms for seating. And saying that, I'm just thinking about that in systems, there's little components. Like if we're looking at a room, you can look at the furniture, you can look at the rugs, you can look at the colors, you can look at the lighting, you can look at the tiles, you can look at if the ceiling has that like popcorn, like I found that really unattractive. So I'm just saying there's a lot of little elements in a system that in small ways you can make changes to make it more inviting and more healing centered. So I'm just trying to think of that analogy to a greater system.
Yeah, I was thinking in regards to, like, if you think about the things that you're talking about, I wonder, and I'm going to ask you, Dr. Dukes, to respond to this. What does it look like to make a system anti-racist, and would it, and this is again, nothing against what you're doing, because I really believe that what you're doing is incredible. I've seen some of your work, but how does it, I'm just thinking as a person of color, if they came in to redo our conference room and they made it more cultural, what would that look like to us? How would that show up for us?
Well, for me, I really wouldn't care what was on the wall because I hear what you say and I see what's in your policy and I see your practices. So wall is cute, but your practices, your engagement, the way you assess children and families of color still sucks. So sucks to you and your wall. So for me, and I think I've already mentioned some of what systems change would look like, especially, I'm child welfare, is looking at policy, looking at practices, looking at engagement. Yes, making sure, that spaces are welcoming is a big part, because I don't want you to come to our agency and it's just a cold room and all that. But I feel like, that's universal. You want people to feel comfortable, period. But the larger thing for me is looking at these policies. Another thing, I do a lot of data in my day-to-day. So we know that prisons are built or, prepared based on 3rd and 4th grade reading benchmarks. But we also know that Black and Brown children are less likely to have access to Head Start and early reading programs and things like that. So for me, system change looks like system change. If we know this at 3rd and 4th grade, or we know this mother is pregnant, where's the work to ensure that she knows, okay, when your child turns this age, we have Head Start, whether it's federally funded, subsidized, or you have to pay for it. However, these people, and I hate the word these people, so let me change it. People are aware of the services that are available to them in their communities to ensure that their family doesn't have deleterious outcomes. So that's system change for me. It means looking at who is losing and having an intentionality around making sure that they're aware of all the services provided to them to change poor outcomes for that family or that community.
Right. It's not a no-sum game. Everyone is losing if we don't work together. There was a question in the chat that I'm going to, pose to you guys. They're asking about in regards to fear and financial gains and loss, which contribute to the overall way of things are. So there is a financial gain on both sides, as we talked about earlier, right, with Ms. McGee's book. What does that look like? It says, can anyone speak to the fear and financial gains and loss, which all contribute to the way that things are? Bianca, you're kind of smiling. I don't know. You want to answer this question?
Oh, was I smiling?
Yeah, maybe you just always smile, but
I was actually hoping, I wasn't completely clear on the question, so I was hoping
it
someone
says,
else would
can
start.
anyone speak to fear in financial gains and laws which contribute to the way that things are? So I know that Miss McGee in her book says we as Americans are living in the bottom of a drained pool, going back to that pool analogy. And she said that if she calls something called the solidarity dividend, she goes, what can be achieved if we link arms together across race? So we have to address white fragility in order to be able to link arms across race, right? Because we have to be able to have these courageous conversations. And what does that look like in regards to financial gains for everyone, and not just for the status quo in society?
You know, I would speak first. I would speak to the perspective of finances. I think I know fear was something that was in that question about, I guess, people losing out on money and other people getting money advantage and taking over. There has to be a reform in how we perceive wealth and money, and I think in this country, there's such an emphasis on people struggling to get money or already having money and keeping it and keeping it and keeping it for yourself and for your own. There has to be a cultural transformation and mentality to want and to desire for other people to have as well, and not for other people to have after scrapping and hustling and doing, working from the bottom up, because we know the bootstrap analogy is not a reality.
Right.
So we have to move past that thinking, well, if they're not succeeding, it's their own fault, and really understand that there are a lot of systems and details and nuances in place that prevent people from actually being able to have their basic needs met. And so if you are sitting comfortably and having above and beyond what your actual needs are, there's an issue when you have people in your same city who are, like in LA, who are on the street and don't have anything. So there has to be a cultural shift when it comes to how we perceive and how we value money. And there needs to be a greater value on people and humanity over paper and coins and use Bitcoin. I don't know, all of that. So
Right.
that would be my response to that.
Well, fear and privilege. And Rebecca, I see you leaning into the screen, so I know you have something delicious to say.
Well, yeah, and I think that's where white fragility shows up again in the systemic ways, this idea of scarcity, and that if there's more equity, that white people are going to lose somehow. I was just talking with a friend about the this year in the UC system, there have been more applications from Black and Brown people than ever before. And I was thinking, like, wow, that's going to be so transformational and wonderful that they'll actually be more representation of those students in the UC system. And then I was thinking, we were talking today about, like, well, how are white people going to react to that? Are they going to feel like they're losing out? Is this being presented as a zero-sum thing? And that idea that, like, some people finally having equity, that can't be perceived by white people as losing out, that's a false narrative, that some people are finally getting what some space that they have never had before, that's not losing out, that's actually equity. But I think white fragility makes it sound like scarcity and sound like people are losing out. And that's where the fear comes in. And that white fear is very destructive. So that's kind of one of the answers to the systemic question that you asked me that I didn't really have such a great answer for. But thinking about that I think the fear is a huge part of it, and really important as well, that people need to take care of their own fear around those issues. White people do.
Dr. Dukes? That's right.
Well,
Take a breath, girl. Take a breath.
I think Tulsa, I think Allensworth, I think the strip of Manhattan Beach that used to be Black owned, but then was taken, is all indicates what fear looks like when there's any semblance of equity or being able to pull ourselves up from our bootstraps, as people would like to say. But we definitely have a culture of profit over people. We definitely have a culture of profit coming on the backs of people of color. The pipeline to prison is a multi-billion-dollar industry. And then I think they said like 75% of those inmates were former foster youth. So even our system is becoming a pipeline to prison. I know in my culture, there's, the saying that everybody eats. There's enough for everybody to eat. I know we participate in a capitalist society, and whenever we talk about, equity or taking care of everybody to where everybody eats, it's socialism or communism or whatever isms. And, I would love to see a shift to where it's humanitarian, you know the word I'm trying to say, to make sure that everybody is taken care of and everybody eats versus it being, I feel race has been politicized at this point. Black Lives Matter has become politicized. And it's like, I'm trying to tell you that Black Lives Matter. Take the politics out of it. Everybody watched, George Floyd take his last breath. There was no politics around it other than that knee that was pressed into his neck, that took his life, that everybody got to see. So I get very, and this is probably, I can't even say fragile in this moment. I get really worked up to where I feel a tightening in my chest. So if I don't speak, it's not because I don't want to speak or I'm feeling fragile. It's because I don't have the words to say that makes what I'm saying palatable. Because I also know, and that's another weight that I carry as a Black woman, is making sure that what comes out of my mouth is palatable. And it's a lot. It's really a lot. Like Bianca said, tired. I'm at the point where I need to drop the the R. I'm tired. Like I'm just all the way across. Just,
Yes.
like I can't. And then to also then be the back on which societies and systems are built and then be called lazy. Like, did I become lazy once I stopped working for free? Or at what point did I become lazy? So it's just a lot. And, like I said, the Black experience is not monolithic. The way I see and view things is not, indicative of all African Americans. There's some, we got Kanye on the way in who thinks, slavery was a choice. And then you have people on the far other end, so the only way we are going to get to the middle and move forward is through collaboration and listening to each other.
So what's interesting about, everything that you guys said, I think back to what I hear often people say who do exhibit some white fragility. So not that I said this earlier, but I'm not a big proponent of white fragility because I do feel it's some kind of a crutch. However, people talk about, and I guess they asked in the chat too, it said, is anyone Black or white? Okay, but the question I have is, it says, what's the issue with being colorblind or non-racist versus anti-racist? And then people will say, well, we're all the same. I'm not racist. I love everyone. Everyone is the same. So going back to their question in the chat, is anyone Black or white if we're all the same? Brita, what do you think about that?
I mean, my knee-jerk response is I think if based on listening for the past hour, clearly we're not all the same. I mean, we have, as you said, we have the shared DNA and being a human, but there's a lot of nuances, and that's what's making this a courageous conversation. It would, if we were all the same, this would be just another Zoom chat. Sorry if I'm being a little flippant, but that's kind of my knee-jerk response to that.
I'm interested, and I'm just going to ask you one follow-up question.
Yeah.
Why do you feel, or what is underlying for the knee-jerk response? Where do you feel that the knee-jerk response comes from? What is your first thought when I ask you that question?
I don't know. I just feel like it we need to be expressive about our differences in a way that's constructive, and recognize that, like, I, as a non-BIPOC person, have a lot of privileges that other people don't have. And I think it's just unfair and not really a productive conversation to take away those privileges that I have and not add them into the conversation, because that's not really going to dismantle any of the white fragility in the room if we take that away, because the white fragility comes from having that privilege.
Yeah, I agree with you. Privilege definitely is a big part of it. Rebecca, what do you think about this concept of colorblindness and non-racist versus being anti-racist?
We have fundamentally different experiences based on how we're perceived and how we move in the world. And I think as a white person, um, I can lean into that default and not have to do that work in a way that Black people and people of color never have that option. And because of that, there's if I want to deal with that, I have to be an anti-racist. There's no such thing as like colorblind. It doesn't exist right now. I don't think it will. It's not our history again.
Absolutely. Bianca, do you want to comment on this before I go to our last question in the audience questions?
Sure, really quick. That question comes from a place of not realizing that even with the 99 or however much percent, we're here now. It's too late to ask that question. This has been set into place hundreds of years ago. For you to say to be colorblind comes from I'm not going to say for that particular person, but in general, people who tend to ask that question, it comes from a place of feeling uncomfortable with acknowledging their own otherness. Because in order for you to feel comfortable with someone who has a different background or different skin color than you, you have to see them as just human and dismiss everything that has built from their race, the culture that has developed from their race. And so actually that is actual form of passive racism, because you're not actively fighting against racism. You are aligning yourself in a lot of ways with the practice of racism, even if you're not actively engaged, or you don't think that you are strongly engaged as being someone who is racist.
Absolutely. And that's almost verbatim what Dr. Kendi said. And I didn't mention his name initially because I kind of wanted to just ask the question and get some responses. But, he says that you can't be non-racist or colorblind because you're not actively fighting against racism. You have to be anti-racist, saying that I am going to advocate and stand against racism. So I'm a big fan of Dr. Kendi and have all of his books and have read them. And I just love that. So I don't believe that there is a ability well, you can be, I should say, you can be colorblind and non-racist, but you're not really being anti-racist, which is what we need in society to move forward and address fragility and have these courageous conversations, which leads me to my final question before I get to the audience questions. So we've had a very amazing, courageous conversation, but what can we do to continue to bridge the divide and get past the point of fragility to have these conversations in the real world? Dr. Dukes?
I don't think there's more that can be said that hasn't already been shared in terms of, moving forward and how and what that's going to look like and what that's going to require. But I definitely know, I didn't get to respond on the last question, that not seeing someone is not the way that you're going to advocate for them. And by you saying, I don't see color, is telling someone, I don't see you. So I definitely know that's not the way to go.
Right. Ms. Rebecca, how can we continue these courageous conversations? What does it take to have a courageous conversation across races in the real world?
I think two things. The first is to continue to do your own introspective work, and reading and learning and growing. And then the other thing is to, for me, it's to put myself in connection with people where I'll have these opportunities, and not in an authentic way. So like, what am I doing? How am I spending my time that I'm connecting with people in order to have these conversations organically. What kind of world am I living in? What kind of community? How do I move in the world? So I think it's those two things. Start with yourself, and then where are you in the world and who are you interacting with?
Miss Brita?
The first thing we've been using the word courageous conversation. And I think that's one of the first steps.
You're going in and out again for a
I
second.
apologize. Okay.
I just want to make sure everyone hears what you had to
Thank
say.
you. I was saying that we're calling these courageous conversations, and I think that's really important to, if you're thinking of them as difficult conversations, to reframe that into as a courageous conversation. The second thing I think, kind of like Rebecca was saying, is that it is very inward, and I think you have to understand what your like go-to embodied reaction is to uncomfortable or courageous conversations. So personally, I like to think about like what is my go-to response, and then think about how does it protect me and what might happen if it doesn't protect me. And that's sort of a way of internally like feeling some of the feels before you're out in the conversation and in a place to do harm.
Thank you. Miss Bianca?
I would echo off of what Rebecca was saying in terms of not just introspective work, but putting yourself into a position to have organic conversations. I think it's important for you to be intentional, for people to be intentional about entering into spaces where they're not necessarily reflected. And that doesn't necessarily mean having one of each friend. I think that means like,
I have that one friend. I'm not racist because I have that one friend, right?
or one of each from every group.
One of each, right? I have that.
That's a good start, but the intentionality should be also to develop organic relationships, and to be intentional about allowing yourself to be in spaces where you are uncomfortable, for those conversations to happen, or just for you to build on that introspect, and practice being uncomfortable.
And I think it also has to do with integrity, honesty, and authenticity. Because what are you saying to your friends when the other or BIPOC people are not in the room? What does that look like? How do you show up? Is it different when somebody who's a BIPOC person walks into the room? And to be honest with yourself, with what you're feeling, and to recognize those feelings, and to say, hey, you know what? I am feeling some privilege. I am exerting my privilege. And am I doing any harm in exerting that privilege? Like, who am I harming by doing that? I think that's important. So thank you, ladies, for that conversation. And so I'm going to get to the audience questions. And this question, this is just me using my privilege right now, because this question I'm going to ask to Bianca and to Tiffany. It says, what do you think of the term melanated instead of Black? I know you guys are laughing because I'm not going to put Rebecca and Brita on the spot. Like, no, I'm not going to ask you guys.
I think it's very interesting because both of my parents are Jamaican. My mom's dad is Cuban. His Cuban and East Indian. So it is very interesting to be then only Black, because then, I share this story with my team, in elementary, when other kids are eating Lunchables, I'm eating curry chicken, rice and peas and plantains for lunch, or when it was time for my prom and people are like, oh, are you going to have a champagne party? And my mom is like, nah, she ain't having no champagne party. What's a champagne party? She can't drink, so there was so much about African-American culture that I didn't know about, or that I still get to learn about, because my family, we eat roti, we eat dal, our Madam Vice President, me and her, she's me, she's Jamaican, she's East Indian, she's me, so I get how, like I said, though, our experience is not monolithic. We're not all, some people really struggle with being called African American, or I've even heard craziness like, Jamaicans are not Black. And I was like, well, tell that to my great grandma whose mother is from Ghana, so it's just interesting. I mean, if you want to be called melanated, that's how you identify, that's what you want to be called. but it is very limiting to either have to pick one or the other, especially when, somebody already has highlighted none of us is one or the other.
Miss Bianca, you're smiling from ear to ear. What is your
I
comment on
am.
this?
I have never.
I wish I had some more melon than me, but
I have never heard that term before, and it makes me smile because I love that that we are in a time where people are really evaluating and assessing and embracing how their identity is and how they want to be identified, and understanding the complexities of our identity as Black people and the diversity of our identity as Black people. And I think if that's what that person wants to be called, then that's their prerogative. I will say I have no idea what a champagne party is, but I was also raised in a place where it was heavily dominated by the Black American folks. So,
did you say you don't know what a champagne party is, Bianca?
I've never heard that before. Maybe I'm on myself. I don't even speak for everybody from my region. So that's just me. I am Black American, but I have never heard that before. But I will say, I wanted to say that for me, I think it has been a journey to unlearn a lot of things that I didn't realize that I had, views that I had about myself as a Black woman, particularly in every realm of my life. So for me, in the place that I am now, I've always embraced my Blackness, and that's what I stand firm in as far as my racial identity. So I think if that's what you identify and that is what is strong to you in your identity, then that's you. If you want to be called melanated and that provides liberty for you and your identity, then that's your choice. And I think that's the beautiful thing about being a part of the diaspora, is that we can embrace who we are in every shade and every heritage and every background that we have.
All right, thank you so much for the answer. And then in regards to a champagne party, it's typically a party you have before prom. You have it for your daughter or the, parents of both couples, the couple does it together, and it's like a little reception, so to speak, before we send you off to prom. Very common here in Southern California. I didn't know it wasn't common everywhere, so that's new to me.
I was home by midnight on my prom night, so.
Okay, so the next question is, what will it look like? We're looking to the future at the point where these conversations become irrelevant. So we no longer have to think about conversations being courageous or uncomfortable. When are we going to get to the point where they're irrelevant?
I haven't thought this one out, but again, my knee-jerk reaction, which I'm going with, is, will these conversations ever be irrelevant? Like, will that take away from the history of these conversations and like how we will have gotten to the point we are in the future? Like, to me, I don't know. I feel like it's always going to be important to know where the conversations originated from, and that in the future, let's say there's this no need for courageous conversations. I personally just don't really see what that's going to look like, because I think there's always going to be an opportunity for another intersection or stage in that type of courageous conversation.
Thank you. So one of the last questions I'm going to ask, and I'm going to start with you, Dr. Dukes, and I think that this is so important before I even, I'm going to preface it with that. But why is data and BIPOC history so important? Particularly because, it's so limited in regards to our upbringing, but why is it so important?
So I see that data is something that's, a lot of people aren't able to digest easily, as far as research design. But I have pushed myself to understand data and research design, because that is the one place that I found a lot more truth than a lot of stories. Jay-Z says, men lie, women lie, numbers don't lie, and I have been able to, challenge a lot of narratives as a result of reading and understanding and processing data. And it's very important because, anybody can tell a story and you then take it in and internalize it as truth. But like I said about the data around, fathers, it's completely contrary to the narrative. So I think it is very important. And I think history is very important, because I know there's also a quote, you can't know where you're going if you don't know where you've come from. So you have to know your history. You have to know, all of the intersecting identities. I've mentioned, I think, 4 different ethnicities that make me up, and I'm able to celebrate and participate in all of those identities because I have the history. I talk to my family about it. I have so many different relatives that, will sit me down and share the history of, all the different immigration reasons why, Indians made it to Jamaica, and, how my great grandmother's mother from East Africa made it to Jamaica. And, you have to know your history. You have to. History, along with data, it dispels a lot of the myths and the, ill-informed narratives that are out there today.
Rebecca or Brita, can you respond to this question? Why do you think it's important to be inclusive of BIPOC history?
Well, is also that, can I talk about the data too as part of that?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay.
That's part of it. Data.
Okay. Yeah.
Yes.
So, I have, my background is in public health, and in graduate school, I had a professor named Sherman James. He's an epidemiologist, and a Black epidemiologist, and he taught us about what he called this concept of John Henryism, and basically that racism in the United States is killing Black people in and of itself directly, that the experience of having to live in a racist society. And I think that kind of data kind of tells the story of our history in a way that's really important. And also, like the work that I'm doing with survivors and incarcerated people and in criminal justice, if we look at the data and we see the disproportionate treatment of Black people and people of color, that data tells us a story that we are not that we are living in a racist society, that we have not addressed these questions, these issues yet, and that is truth, that people are living and dying directly because of this history, and it's not history, it's current, and that we have to know what's happening in the past to be able to still continue to address it in the present, and it's truth.
Absolutely. Bianca, do you want to respond to that before we wrap up our final thoughts?
I would affirm everything that's been said. The importance of knowing where we come from is a point of empowerment and a resource of empowerment, to know that we are not defined by necessarily what has been taught to us, but that there's more to who we are than what the people in power have said we are. So knowing that is powerful in shaping our identity and empowering us to have agency over our own stories.
Thank you. So ladies, final thoughts. I'll give you guys each a few seconds just to wrap up what you thought about tonight's conversation. I'll start with Ms. Brita.
In full vulnerability, I think, there was moments in this webinar I had to check my own white fragility and was experiencing, and I'm just very honored to have had this space with you all to sort of, have these conversations and model for everyone that's watching what these conversations can look like. And I'm just grateful to share space with everyone.
Thank you. Dr. Dukes.
I really enjoyed the conversation. I really liked being able to hear and share. As much as I like to teach, I also love to learn. And my final remarks would be for everybody to make sure you know who you are well enough so no one has the space to tell you who you are.
Thank you. Ms. Rebecca.
Gratitude for everybody who showed up and the ability for me to hear what people had to say.
Thank you. Ms. Bianca.
Yeah, I just want to say that I'm grateful to have had this opportunity to be a part of this panel and to have this important conversation. And I think if there's anything if there's anything that I'll take away, is that there's still more to be said, and I hope that it generates more conversations for other people outside of here, and not just talking, but also putting into action that anti-racism that we need to have.
Definitely actionable steps. So I'll end with a quote from James Baldwin. We can disagree and still love each other unless your disagreement is rooted in my oppression and denial of my humanity and right to exist. I'll turn it back over to Wendy to wrap us up.
Thank you all for your time and for joining us this evening and for sharing this space as we close our 3-part series. We invite you to complete a quick survey that will be shared in the chat to gain general feedback from our guest. If you missed one of our webinars, subscribe to our YouTube channel where you can access them all at one place. These conversations were necessary, and we are so honored that you have joined us. If you enjoyed tonight's conversation, please join us next month for our upcoming collaboration with Repair called Creating Justice. The Creating Justice virtual series will be hosted by Lorraine Bonner and Ramona Mershon, our moderator this evening, and will focus on racism, activism, and resistance to the criminal justice system. Join us every other Wednesday in March and May, and register by following the link in the chat. Please subscribe to our podcast, Our Stories Matter, to listen to more stories of resilience and healing transformation. Be sure to follow us on Instagram, Twitter, LinkedIn, Facebook, to learn more about Trauma Informed LA, and we invite you to visit our website where you can find our virtual reading room and marketplace that highlights BIPOC-owned businesses. And we thank you again for a wonderful evening. Very quickly, just a sneak peek of what our website looks like, so please feel free to take a look. Thank you all.